In the shadowed rooms of Washington, D.C., and across the Atlantic in secret labs, a silent war was being fought. Not with guns, tanks, or airplanes, but with brains, patience, and ingenuity. The enemy believed their communications were unbreakable. Every command, every plan, every movement of the German war machine was encrypted in a cipher so complex it seemed like magic. The Enigma code. Hitler and his generals believed their messages traveled invisibly, untouchable, unassailable. They were wrong. America's response was quiet at first. A handful of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers, ordinary men and women with extraordinary minds, were tasked with a mission that few outside the government could understand. OP-20G, the U.S. Navy's cryptographic office, worked in silence, day and night, decoding the patterns of the German Navy. Meanwhile, American cryptographers collaborated with British intelligence at Bletchley Park, sharing ideas, breakthroughs, and algorithms that would change the course of the war. For every Enigma machine the Germans produced, for every message encrypted, the Americans raced against time. Every decoded message could save a convoy from a U-boat attack, protect soldiers landing on a distant shore, or prevent entire towns from being bombed. Yet the work was invisible, and the stakes were enormous. One misstep, one missed letter, could cost thousands of lives. The rooms were dim, filled with the quiet clatter of typewriters, the scratch of pencils on paper, the low hum of early computers. Faces were tired, eyes red from long hours, yet minds were sharper than any blade. These were men and women who understood the weight of secrecy. The outside world had no idea that victory often depended on their calculations, their intuition, their persistence. Every breakthrough was a battle won. Every decrypted message was a silent bullet in a war fought without uniforms. When a U-boat Wolfpack moved through the Atlantic, men in Washington knew hours before the first torpedo struck. When the Luftwaffe prepared to target Allied convoys or airfields, cryptographers intercepted, decoded, and warned commanders in time to reroute planes, reinforce defenses, and save lives. It was painstaking work. Patterns had to be recognized in endless streams of letters, rotor settings analyzed, codes tested and retested. Machines called Bombay and later early computers like the American equivalents became extensions of human ingenuity, speeding up calculations that once would have taken months. Yet the Germans adapted constantly, believing their codes unbreakable. And every time, the Americans found a way. The stakes of secrecy weighed heavily. Not a word could escape. These men and women could not share their victories at home, nor could they seek glory. Families saw exhausted faces and late-night lamps, but they did not understand the reason behind the long hours. The entire war depended on trust, on focus, on quiet heroism. And then came the moments of triumph that few outside the inner circle would ever witness. Convoys rerouted just in time. Entire German fleet movements anticipated. U-boat attacks thwarted. Each success was invisible on the battlefield, but monumental in impact. Commanders who later told tales of luck, of foresight, or miraculous intelligence were unknowingly benefiting from the quiet genius of American cryptographers. The pressure was relentless. Failure was not an option, yet success could never be celebrated. These unsung heroes watched battles unfold on the newsreels, saw ships sinking and soldiers marching, knowing that sometimes a single decoded message had prevented disaster, and yet no one would ever know their names. The burden was immense, yet they persevered. Even as the war escalated in Europe and the Pacific, American cryptographers never faltered. Their work created a shadow front where minds clashed with machines, where logic and intuition battled codes designed to hide the truth. The Germans boasted of invincibility, of a war waged with precision and secrecy, unaware that their own calculations were feeding the very force that would dismantle their plans. And by 1943, the turning point was unmistakable. Convoys crossed safely, U-boats were sunk in record numbers, and Allied strategies could be executed with the confidence of knowledge. Hitler's generals grew frustrated, baffled, and desperate, unable to explain why their most secure plans were consistently anticipated. Yet the public remained ignorant, unaware that America's silent army of thinkers was waging a decisive war in the shadows. For those who cracked the codes, it wasn't glory they sought. It was survival, duty, and the understanding that the difference between life and death for thousands could hinge on a single insight. They were ordinary Americans, mathematicians, engineers, linguists, clerks, who became extraordinary by facing an enemy of intellect, discipline, and secrecy. And so, in the quiet offices, among humming machines and endless streams of letters, the Americans outsmarted the Nazis. They proved that ingenuity, courage, and perseverance could wield as much power as any rifle or bomb. The Enigma machines, once symbols of invincibility, became testaments to human intellect as American codebreakers transformed secrecy into strategy, chaos into victory, and numbers into life-saving truth. When the war ended, the full story of these cryptographers would only emerge decades later, but the impact was immediate and undeniable. Convoys reached ports, soldiers lived to fight another day, and the Allied forces gained an intelligence advantage so decisive it helped shorten the war. Hitler's strategies, once shrouded in certainty, crumbled under the quiet brilliance of minds who refused to yield. The Codebreakers had changed the course of history. They had fought battles no one could see, achieved victories no one would cheer, and proven that in a war for survival, brains could be as lethal as bullets, and courage could take the form of persistence in the face of endless encrypted nights. In every victory on the beaches, in the skies, and on the seas, a piece of that invisible struggle had played out. The work of Americans who understood that sometimes the greatest weapon is knowledge, and the greatest battlefield is the mind. And in that silent war, America won.
By 1942, the stakes had never been higher. Across the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic raged, and German U-boats prowled with deadly precision. Merchant ships laden with vital supplies vanished beneath the waves, leaving convoys crippled and morale shaken. On the surface, it seemed like luck or fate, but beneath the waves and behind closed doors, the real war was being waged on a table strewn with charts, letters, and primitive calculating machines. In Arlington, Virginia, a young cryptographer named Genevieve McAllister studied the patterns of German communications late into the night. Her fingers hovered over the typewriter as she meticulously logged repeated sequences, noting rotor settings, letter substitutions, and cipher anomalies. Around her, the room hummed with a quiet intensity, men and women working in synchrony, each aware that a single misstep could spell disaster. Outside, the city slept, unaware that a war of intellect was unfolding in their midst. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's liaison officers coordinated with Britain's Bletchley Park. They exchanged ciphers, decoding techniques, and insights about the infamous Enigma machine. Each breakthrough was hard-earned, a slight pattern here, a repeated mistake there, a rotor alignment confirmed after endless trial and error. Success required not only skill, but imagination, the ability to think like the enemy, to anticipate not just a message, but the mind behind it. Back in Berlin, German spy masters noted anomalies in their encrypted traffic. Messages that were supposed to be secure seemed somehow anticipated by Allied commanders. Orders that should have remained secret were countered with precision. Hitler scoffed at the reports. "Our codes are perfect," he said. Yet Admiral Canaris and other officers knew the truth. American ingenuity was eroding the veil of their security. Every convoy sunk, every tactical miscalculation traced back to a brain far from the battlefield made the enemy uneasy. The work was grueling. For cryptographers, days blurred into nights. Early mechanical computers clattered in the background as operators fed reels of data, searched for repeats, tested permutations. Mistakes were unforgiving. One error could produce an incorrect warning or miss a submarine lurking along the Atlantic shipping lanes. Lives hung in the balance, yet the team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that each correct decryption saved hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers and sailors. Some victories were almost cinematic in their timing. In early 1943, intelligence intercepted German orders directing a Wolfpack of U-boats to intercept a convoy carrying tanks and ammunition to Britain. By analyzing rotor positions and message patterns, American cryptographers deduced the exact timing and location of the attack. Allied naval commanders rerouted the convoy, dispatched destroyers, and ambushed the U-boats. The result? No ships lost, several enemy subs destroyed, and a confidence boost for the Allied Atlantic Fleet. But to the world, it appeared as luck, a stroke of providence, never revealing the minds and machines that had orchestrated it. Amid the numbers and codes, human stories emerged. Young men and women, some barely out of college, became pioneers of a new kind of warfare. They worked in isolation, rarely speaking of their accomplishments. A mathematician named Harold Johnson, who had once tutored high school students, now calculated rotor positions for hours on end, knowing the lives of sailors depended on his accuracy. A linguist, Anna Weiss, traced letter frequencies in messages written by German U-boat commanders, her intuition guiding the team past seemingly impossible obstacles. Even under immense secrecy, camaraderie flourished. Late-night jokes, whispered encouragement, shared cups of coffee, and the quiet pride of understanding one's contribution to a much larger cause sustained them. These were ordinary Americans who became extraordinary because the war demanded it. Their battlefield was logic and intellect. Their bullets were patterns, equations, and encrypted letters. And each success, each decrypted message, was a strike against tyranny more powerful than any artillery shell. As months passed, the Americans refined their methods. The Enigma, once thought unbreakable, began to yield its secrets systematically. Every U-boat intercepted, every convoy safeguarded, every planned attack neutralized, chipped away at Hitler's confidence in his supposedly invincible codes. German officers noticed a pattern they could not explain. Messages anticipated, orders countered, strategies undone. Panic began to seep into their command structure. Hitler's insistence on ideological certainty blinded him further. He could not accept that a small team of Americans, armed with little more than intellect and persistence, could so thoroughly outmatch his carefully constructed machine. By the time 1943 drew to a close, the quiet triumph of American codebreakers had reshaped the Atlantic. The Allies had achieved the decisive advantage, cutting supply lines, preventing strategic losses, and giving naval commanders the foresight to act with precision. Lives were saved in numbers too vast to count, yet the world knew nothing of the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the mental battles waged far from the front lines. This invisible war demonstrated a crucial truth. Victory did not always belong to the strongest army or the largest fleet. Sometimes it belonged to those who dared to think differently, to work tirelessly in obscurity, and to believe that intelligence, patience, and courage could move the course of history. The minds in Arlington, the young women and men at OP-20G, the mathematicians and linguists who toiled in silence, they were the unsung heroes who ensured that every soldier on the battlefield, every pilot in the sky, and every convoy crossing the Atlantic could rely on knowledge as their shield. The Germans may have mocked, laughed, and doubted. Hitler may have dismissed intelligence reports as flawed, but American ingenuity, persistence, and collaboration had created a weapon far more lethal than a gun or bomb. Certainty. Knowledge of the enemy, turned into action, became the invisible hand guiding victory. And for those who had mastered the codes, each day brought a quiet satisfaction, a victory unseen, yet felt across oceans, in the skies above Europe, and along the Atlantic convoys. They were ordinary Americans doing extraordinary work, proving that in war, sometimes the greatest battles are won not on the front lines, but in the minds of those brave enough to challenge secrecy, outthink tyranny, and illuminate the darkness with intelligence.
By 1944, the fruits of American codebreaking were undeniable. The Allies had gained an edge that was invisible, but decisive, a power that allowed entire operations to unfold with surgical precision. The intelligence from OP-20G and collaborating teams guided naval convoys safely across the Atlantic, ensured reinforcements reached the beaches of Normandy, and gave commanders a level of foresight that the Germans could neither predict nor counter. One of the most striking demonstrations of this power came during the U-boat Wolfpack assaults. German submarines, designed to choke Britain's lifeline, were intercepted repeatedly. Each decrypted message allowed Allied destroyers to anticipate movements, lay traps, and neutralize threats before they could strike. Convoys that would have otherwise been annihilated crossed the ocean with minimal losses. The terror that once haunted merchant sailors, the silent, unseen hunters beneath the waves, began to wane. At the same time, intelligence from decrypted Luftwaffe messages informed the planning of Operation Overlord. American commanders knew where German reinforcements were concentrated, which units could be delayed, and where defenses were weakest. It was as if the enemy had inadvertently provided the Allies with a detailed blueprint of their own vulnerabilities. Every letter decoded was a piece of the puzzle that would ultimately secure victory on the beaches of Normandy. Yet these victories were not without tension. Cryptographers lived in constant pressure, knowing that the smallest error could cost lives. Rotor settings changed, codes evolved, and German operators became more cautious. Every day was a mental marathon. Yet the teams pressed on, fueled by a sense of duty and an unwavering belief that their work mattered, that the lives of soldiers, sailors, and airmen depended on their accuracy and persistence. Even amidst the technical triumphs, human courage shone through. Operators worked through exhaustion, often sleeping only a few hours before resuming their calculations. They relied on intuition as much as logic, reading between the lines of encrypted messages, anticipating the enemy's intentions, and making decisions that commanders on the front lines would later rely upon without knowing their origin. The invisible heroes were as vital as any pilot, sailor, or infantryman engaged in combat. Across the Atlantic, in Germany, frustration mounted. U-boat commanders reported unexpected losses, convoys disappeared before they could strike, and strategic initiatives failed inexplicably. German intelligence tried to adapt, but every attempt to outwit the Americans fell short. Hitler, entrenched in ideology, dismissed warnings and evidence, confident that his codes were secure. Yet the Abwehr, Canaris, and other observant officers knew the truth. A quiet, invisible force was dismantling their plans, and the enemy could do nothing to stop it. The climax of these efforts unfolded during the summer of 1944. Allied fleets armed with knowledge from decrypted communications intercepted critical German convoys attempting to reinforce occupied Europe. American cryptographers had identified not only the routes, but also the timing, allowing ships to be rerouted, submarines to be hunted, and Luftwaffe support to be neutralized. Entire battles were influenced by calculations made hundreds of miles away, in dimly lit rooms filled with typewriters, charts, and the hum of early computing machines. This period also highlighted the profound collaboration between nations. American and British intelligence teams shared breakthroughs, algorithms, and rotor settings, forming a unified front against a common enemy. Knowledge flowed across the Atlantic, ensuring that no single intelligence office operated in isolation. The synergy amplified results. Breakthroughs in America accelerated efforts in Britain, which in turn provided critical insights back across the ocean. Together, they created a web of information that was far more powerful than any single battlefield weapon. Despite these successes, the human cost remained real. Operators endured exhaustion, stress, and the constant weight of responsibility. Their triumphs were invisible, their sacrifices unrecognized, yet the impact of their work was monumental. Lives were saved, operations succeeded, and strategic advantages secured, all without a single shot fired. These unsung heroes embodied a form of courage rarely celebrated, demonstrating that bravery can exist not only in battle, but in intellect, patience, and unwavering dedication. By the end of 1944, the Germans had begun to realize the scale of their miscalculation. The war they believed they were controlling was slipping away, not through brute force, but through the quiet, relentless genius of American minds. Every U-boat sunk, every convoy preserved, and every successful Allied maneuver traced its lineage back to cryptographers who had turned Enigma from an instrument of fear into a map of opportunity. And so, the stage was set for the final push. With intelligence guiding strategy, Allied forces advanced across Europe with an unseen advantage. Each soldier on the front lines, each ship at sea, and each pilot in the air benefited from the invisible hand of codebreakers. They were the hidden architects of victory, turning secrecy into foresight, chaos into order, and uncertainty into decisive action. The story of these American codebreakers was more than just mathematics and machines. It was a story of courage under pressure, of ordinary individuals achieving extraordinary feats, of human intellect confronting the mightiest military machine in the world and prevailing. Their work had transformed war itself, proving that the mind can be as lethal and decisive as any weapon in the arsenal. By early 1945, the fruits of American cryptography had ripened into decisive victory. The once feared U-boat menace of the Atlantic had been neutralized. Allied convoys moved with confidence, supplying troops across Europe with tanks, ammunition, and reinforcements. Hitler's codes, once symbols of invincibility, had been rendered vulnerable by the minds and machines of Americans who worked in silence. The war was being won not only on beaches and battlefields, but in dimly lit offices where intellect, perseverance, and ingenuity triumphed over fear and secrecy. Across the Atlantic, operations flowed with an almost prophetic precision. Allied commanders directed fleets, planned strikes, and anticipated enemy movements with a level of certainty the Germans could not imagine. Convoys crossed the ocean unscathed, strategic attacks unfolded exactly as planned, and entire German naval strategies faltered under the invisible hand of intelligence. Every life saved, every mission completed, traced back to the quiet heroes who had mastered the language of secrecy. In the hearts and minds of the codebreakers, there was no celebration, no medals pinned for every successful decryption. Their victories were silent, invisible to the public eye, yet monumental in consequence. They had waged a war of intellect and won, turning logic into strategy and insight into survival. Their triumphs were measured in lives saved, battles won, and a course of history irrevocably altered. And as the Allied armies advanced across Europe, liberating towns and cities from the grip of tyranny, the invisible work of cryptographers had paved the way. D-Day, the push through France, the eventual crossing into Germany, all were informed by intelligence that flowed from Washington and Arlington, from machines clattering in hidden rooms, from minds that refused to yield. Hitler's generals could plan, maneuver, and calculate, but they could not outthink the Americans who had turned every message, every pattern, and every cipher into a weapon of unprecedented power. The end of the war revealed the magnitude of their contribution. Decades later, the story of OP-20G, of American mathematicians, linguists, and engineers would emerge from secrecy, earning recognition long overdue. But even without recognition, the work had already spoken. The Allied victory, the preservation of countless lives, and the eventual liberation of Europe were living testaments to the brilliance, courage, and quiet heroism of these codebreakers. Their legacy was profound. They proved that wars could be won not only with rifles, bombs, and ships, but with intellect, foresight, and unwavering dedication. They showed that ordinary Americans, placed in extraordinary circumstances, could shape the course of history. In rooms where no one saw, behind doors where silence reigned, these men and women had fought Hitler and the Nazis with a weapon more potent than steel: knowledge. And so, as the guns fell silent and the world began to rebuild, the invisible victory of America's codebreakers stood as a reminder of what courage truly meant. Not the courage to charge into battle, though that was valor in its own right, but the courage to endure, to think, to solve the unsolvable, and to persist when the eyes of the world were not watching. In the end, America had triumphed not only through might, but through the mind. Every encrypted letter cracked, every pattern decoded, every message anticipated had shifted the tide. Hitler's plans, once shrouded in secrecy, had been undone by human determination, intelligence, and vision. And the codebreakers, unsung and unseen, had delivered a victory that would echo through history, proving that even in the darkest of wars, the power of intellect, courage, and relentless perseverance could illuminate the path to freedom. The war had been won, and the silent heroes had spoken, not with weapons, not with fanfare, but with the quiet brilliance of minds that refused to fail.